From Toronto, Canada, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serra.
Thanks for inviting me into your home. Long-haul truck, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' well-appointed rec room with the simulated wood paneling, electric fireplace, and the painting of dogs playing poker. Your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. Hello to everyone tuning in on one of our affiliate stations. Hey You, streaming us live at the YouTube channel, Strange Planet, the YouTube channel. How do to those of you gathered in the YouTube live stream chat, and however and wherever you're listening, I bid thee the warmest of welcomes, and I thank you for your fine company. What is it about trains, especially the sound of a distant rumbling train, steel wheels on a steel track? To me, there's nothing as nostalgic, as longing, as the sound of a train horn in the night. The train winding its way through the darkness, connecting destinations unknown. It's comforting, it's haunting, and it turns out, perhaps not so surprisingly, that trains and railways can be paranormal hotspots. And for the next hour, that is where we're headed. Haunted rails. Matthew L. Swayne is a journalist who currently works as a research writer at Penn State. He's worked as a reporter, as a music reviewer for several newspapers and online outlets such as CenterDaily.com and Music.com. He's a regular contributor to the recently revitalized version of Omni Magazine called Omni Reboot. He writes the Antimatter column, which looks at fringe science and the paranormal for the online magazine. He's also worked on writing projects with Paranormal State's Eilfie Music, balancing skepticism with an open mind. Matt uses his experiences in journalism and interest in both ghost lore and the paranormal to collect and tell stories about the supernatural. He's the author of several books, including Haunted Rock and Roll, Ghosts of Country Music, America's Haunted Universities, Haunted World War II, more haunted rock and roll, and his latest, Haunted Rails, Tales of Ghost Trains, Phantom Conductors, and Other Railroad Spirits. Matt Swayne, welcome back to The Conspiracy Show. How are you? How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. It's an honor and pleasure.
I always look forward to speaking with you, Matt. You're such a wonderful story writer. And I mentioned off the top of the show how it was coincidental, maybe not so much. I was talking about trains, and then the day on the show, opening the show, because I was reminding people they might hear the train in the studio where I'm at, because we're about 200 meters from the CN tracks, which is about the busiest rail corridor in Canada. And I was mentioning how I love the sound of the train. I grew up in Brantford, just a couple miles from the old TH&B Railroad, Toronto, Hamilton, Buffalo line. I would fall asleep to that sound. And I would almost be carried away by the sound of the horn and the idea of, traveling through the night in our dreams as a train does to destinations unknown. A couple days later, your name popped into my head. I wonder what Matt Swayne is up to. And lo and behold, you get back to me. I'm working on a book on haunted railroads, you said. Or you've just completed a book.
Right, right.
Why railroads this time?
Well, I think my experience really mimics your experience. I was born in central Pennsylvania. I was born actually in Altoona, Pennsylvania, which is, some probably would say that it's the capital of the railroad in Pennsylvania, and maybe even the East Coast. It has a fine tradition of that. But I was raised in Tyrone, which is a little town about maybe 20 miles north of Altoona. And my house was right across the stream from the main line that would go from Altoona to Harrisburg. And like you, I love the sound of the train. I come from a long line of railroad people. My grandfather was an engineer. His father was an engineer. I grew up with these stories. I also loved railroad history. I worked with his name's Mike Bazilla. He's one of the foremost experts on railroad history. So I would always talk to him and engage him in conversations about railroad. And he and I basically came up with this idea because one of the things that we noted was that there was always these ghost stories associated with the railroad itself. And in my own hometown, there were maybe 3 or 4 stories that revolved around ghosts of engineers or conductors or accident victims, all in this small area. So what I try to do with my books is I try to explore things that I'm interested in, things I want to learn more about, in this case, railroad history, and then couple it with, the paranormal, the supernatural. I was born on Halloween, so that's kind of the way I roll. But so that's really the origin of this book. And it typically starts out where I'm not sure whether I have enough material for a book. But in this case, I probably left out volumes of what I could have and maybe should have included. But there was just so much information out there.
Now, I saw a video on YouTube recently. Someone sent it to me. And it was a ball of light. And I don't know if it was ball lightning, which is an interesting phenomena. But it was a ball of light that was traveling across from one side of a railroad track and across the track, sort of up and over. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Is there something about, steel tracks that might generate a phenomenon like that? Have you seen that video? While you were researching the book, did you get reports of things that appear to be balls of light around railroad tracks?
Well, I did see that video. In fact, 3, maybe 4 of my readers sent me that clip to see what I thought. And it actually seems a lot like there are numerous stories of light phenomena accompanying railroad tracks. I know that I have maybe about 3 or 4 in the book itself. The one that stands out to me is the Mako light, which is a light that has been seen in Mako Station in North Carolina. And this is an interesting story because President Grover Cleveland was visiting that area, and he noticed that the conductors had 2 lamps in their hands where normally they have 1. So he inquired, why do they have 2? Why not 1? I've seen them all have that they've had 1 before. And the reply he got was a little shocking for him. They said that they carry 2 in that area because this ball light phenomena is so prevalent that they want to make sure people know it's really people and not whatever this ghost spirit is. So there are a lot of stories that relate to accidents, crime, all along these railroad tracks. And normally this phenomena comes out as either a ball of lightning, and it sort of reminds me of that video. Now, the video to me was so super spooky because it seemed like it was traveling along the tracks. Most of the lights that I researched in this book seem to be more like orbs in a certain area, generally described as about the brightness of a flashlight or a lantern, about 2 to 3 feet above the ground. And I don't think I've really came across anything where it almost seemed like an intelligent as that footage was.
It's interesting because in this, when we're talking about haunted railways, sometimes we're talking about the ghosts of maybe a passenger or maybe a rail worker, maybe the engineer, but sometimes the trains themselves are ghosts. And you mentioned President Grover Cleveland, who was the 22nd and 24th president. Tell me about Abraham Lincoln's funeral train.
Yeah, that is the most famous piece of railroad ghost lore out there. And it also reminds me of when I was looking into the ghosts of World War II. There were a few cases, more than a few cases, of ghost planes. And that's where it's not that there is a ghost in a plane, it's that the actual plane itself is a ghost. And likewise, when I was researching haunted rails, there are a few stories of ghost trains. The trains themselves are the phantom object. And in the Abraham Lincoln case is very kind of a poignant story. But when Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated, he went on a sort of a victory tour of the Northeast and the Midwest. And it started in Illinois and went to Indiana, through New York, Pennsylvania, into Maryland, and finally into Washington, D.C. And they had planned at the end of the war to do a reverse, to go through this same trail, but in a reverse way back to Illinois. Unfortunately, as we all know, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, so there wasn't a victory tour after the war, but what there was Abraham Lincoln's funeral train, and that occurred on April 19th, 1865, and of course we just passed the anniversary, but the ghost story that surrounds that is that if you go out along this path that the funeral train took on the anniversary that it went through that area, you'll be able to see, and it's described in a lot of different ways, but probably the most common is that if you're along that area or near those tracks, suddenly everything becomes very, very dark. If the moon's out, it's covered with clouds. And then you see this light, a bright light, and some people say that witnesses have said they've seen flame shooting out of the smokestack as this phantom train appears. And if you wait there long enough, I think I would have bugged out long before that. They say that you'll see this train go by, and there is a car with a coffin in. The American flag is draped over it. And there are a squad of Civil War soldiers. Sometimes they're described as ghosts. Sometimes they're described as skeletons, kind of guarding this casket. And so the legend has it that this is Abraham Lincoln's funeral train, and it's a ghost train. And that's really the story with that one.
And this was, of course, the age of the steam engine. So this was a big black steam engine, and it would have fire, no doubt, belching out of its smokestack. Mm-hmm. And this train, is the funeral train back in 1865, as you detail in the book, it stopped through something like 400 different communities.
Right.
So that particular rail line is still in existence, is it? Is it used by other trains today?
Well, that's the real key to it, because parts of it are still being used and parts of it aren't. So there are some parts of the legend say that all you have to do is be in that area where it went through.
And have you tried to retrace the journey of that funeral train? Have you been able to determine sort of where the most sightings of this ghost train are along its route?
That's an interesting question, because this seems to be more in the ghost lore realm. What you find is sort of a general kind of story. Not that I couldn't find any specific site where people had claimed to have actually seen this. And, I did some kind of deep dive into it to try to find a person who would tell this story. But what I find is kind of a bunch of stories about the train itself, but not tied to a certain location. And in this case, I think it is one way that these ghost stories, these railroad ghost stories, tell both the history of the railroad as well as the history of some key events in American history. And in this case, it's Abraham Lincoln's assassination and death, and it pays homage to him. That's as near as I can tell. I've never been able to find a first-person witness to anything like this.
In general, though, why are railroads so haunted, do you suppose?
That's that's really the key question for me, because as I write these things, and again, I'm usually mystified when I start off that, I find all these stories about these, essentially what would be an industry. I mean, I don't, I go into it thinking maybe there's a few I'm really going to have to dig, but there's so many. And I think with I have a couple theories about haunted railroad history. I mean, the first thing that I think needs to be said is just how dangerous railroading was and still is. And, I always put this out there when I'm talking about these ghost stories. I know there's a lot of ghost hunters out there. This is something you really have to be super cautious of, because the railroad is still a dangerous business. But, back in history, throughout history, it was even more dangerous, probably much more dangerous. As an aside, I remember going to my grandfather's house, and he would have these railroad union magazines. And I always remember seeing many, many ads in these railroad magazines for artificial arms and legs and hooks and things like that, because it was so dangerous. And someone getting their arm cut off or decapitated probably wasn't that uncommon. So of course, when there's danger, when there's death, you're going to have ghost stories. And also there were a lot of train robberies that also kind of magnified this effect. And if you talk to a lot of the paranormal theorists, they'll tell you that these deaths, these accidents, this high intensity kind of life can actually imprint itself on time and space. So that's one likely reason why either we tell these stories to kind of commemorate these accidents and this violence, or, the paranormal theorists will actually tell you that that's one of the reasons why we're seeing ghosts as it reenacts over and over again. A lot of times I bring up in the book about residual hauntings, and that's certainly a part of this. Another fact is that there were a lot of heroes in railroad history, engineers who saved the lives of their passengers after an accident. That's a theme that pops up. But I have a peculiar theory about these stories. And when I researched haunted rock and roll and also haunted World War II, the thing that pops up in my mind all the time is this elevation of consciousness, that certain things like music, like the terror of war, elevates our consciousness and makes us more maybe susceptible or more open to supernatural phenomena. So what's so consciousness raising about trains? I'm sure that's one of the questions people ask. But you have to remember, first of all, that trains changed our ideas of time and space. What used to take days suddenly only took hours, transportation-wise, getting supplies and goods across the country. That changed how we really looked at time and space. So I think that has kind of a consciousness shocking aspect of it. But the other thing is, and this comes up quite a bit, is just the economic vitality that railroads provided and still provide to communities. I mean, communities could be absolutely devastated if they weren't close to a railroad line or the railroads didn't get through. And so you have this industry that is so important. Lifeblood comes up all the time. And so that's why I think railroads, trains, beyond just the mystique that they have that you commented on and that I've recognized, beyond that mystique, I think there's real reasons why that this profound change in transportation also kind of changes the way we look at life and death.
We're just rolling into a break here shortly, just a couple minutes, but are there certain towns and cities that seem to be more haunted in terms like railroad towns? Are there what are the most haunted railroad towns and cities?
Yeah, there are a few, and I know this is going to sound biased, and I'm a little prejudiced, but Altoona, Pennsylvania seems to be one of the towns that either is the most haunted or has the highest number of people who document these things, because there are several stories about the Railroad Museum in Altoona is allegedly haunted. A lot of stories about that. Nearby Altoona, right outside of Altoona, is this incredible architectural feat called Horseshoe Curve. That's haunted. And then there's a lot of ghost lore associated with all those lines around there. So I would say Altoona, Ogden, Utah, believe it or not, has a lot of haunted paranormal phenomena attached to railroad train stations and things like that. And also Savannah, Georgia, I noticed is pretty active with railroad ghosts.
All right, we'll take a time out. When we come back, we'll get into some specific stories. Haunted Railways with Matt Swayne right here on The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Serrett. Don't go away.
Providing the evidence and letting you draw your own conclusions. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett.
Welcome back. We're talking haunted railways with Matt Swayne. And you mentioned the Railroaders Memorial Museum in Altoona, Pennsylvania. What's happening there, Matt, late at night?
There's a lot of crazy stuff that goes on there. Probably one of the most famous stories that happened there occurred when and remember, this is an organization staff with a lot of volunteers and some employees. And one of the employees was a finance director. And the finance director was the one who pretty much stayed late. And he had an office, I think, in the fourth floor. And he tells the story that it was, pretty late, and he was getting out of his office, and he jumped into the elevator, and that's not so unusual. He did it every night, but this night was a little different. He saw what looked like a person with his back to him. And when he entered the elevator, he was sort of surprised to see this figure. And then this finance director said the person turned around, looked at him, and smiled. And then there was sort of an electrical shimmy, and then this phantom just faded out. And so freaked out the finance director pretty badly. The next day, he goes and he starts telling some of the volunteers what he saw. And so they took him down to this section of the railroad that has a lot of pictures of the engineers and the workers and whatnot, historical photos, old black and white photos. And they take him to the room and they say, is he in any of these pictures? And this finance director immediately pinpoints the one individual in the one picture, and everyone who had a run-in with this ghost concurred that was the same person that they saw. And this fellow's name was Frank, and so since then, the Railroaders Museum has talked about the ghost of Frank. I talked to a ghost hunter. There's a few paranormal investigative teams that are allowed to either lead tours or do their own investigations. They're pretty careful with who they let in. I talked to a couple that led some of those investigations and some of those tours, and they had other stories beyond this idea of Frank. They say that there are several ghosts in that area, and one is Frank, but there's a few others, and they say it may be related both to the railroad history of this building, which I think was a shop at one point, and I think some offices were there. But also at one time it was kind of an impromptu police station. If you know anything about railroad workers, they were kind of a hard living, and they were also kind of a hard drinking lot. So they at one point had this as both a little bit of a hospital and a little bit of a police station. So a lot of that, according to these ghost hunters, a lot of that residual energy is still in that place.
And do they tend to be residual hauntings? In other words, the ghost seems to be an echo or a memory. It doesn't have consciousness that you can interact with.
Yeah, it seems to be that way, although, at times these stories kind of blend. For instance, the finance director, that almost feels like an intelligent haunting to me too, where it recognized this fella's presence and turned around to face him, and even made some facial gestures, a smile in some of the stories. That's how it's described. So you do see a blend of but overwhelmingly, I would agree with you. I would say they're more residual than anything.
We mentioned ghost trains earlier with the Abraham Lincoln ghost train, funeral train. There's a Canadian story as well regarding a ghost train. I think it was actually even commemorated in a postage stamp, and it's I think it's the St. Louis, Saskatchewan ghost train.
Yeah, that actually made its way onto a postage stamp, and that's a little bit of a story about ghost lights, and a little bit of story about a ghost train. Now, the ghost lights are seen by a lot of the people in that area. Again, it looks like a big white light, a big orb of white light, but in some of the stories, they also see a little red light, which they claim is also the caboose. And there are a few stories attached to this phenomena. One is that there was a conductor killed during a robbery. The train had stopped for, I think, in some reason or another. I think maybe because of snow, and some robbers had targeted this, and the conductor died in a struggle. Another is that it's an accident victim. But again, we have a similar story where you see this light phenomena, and a lot of people say that this is actually a ghost train.
And well, the fact that it's been commemorated on a stamp, obviously this ghost story has some legs. So have there been a lot of witnesses to this?
There are quite a few of witnesses of this phenomena over the years. And of course, there's a lot of witnesses who come forward who say they see the light. There are a lot of people who try to debunk it. A lot of skeptics go after that. And then there's kind of like this counter debunking, I guess, if that's a term, where they take the skeptic's point of view and then they say, well, that can't be it either. I know in a lot of these cases, they say that the lights are actually maybe a car beyond, up the tracks a little, crossing the tracks or something like that. In this case, they say that the phenomena went way before, when there were roads in those areas, and that it's seen in different places. Now, that doesn't necessarily rule out atmospheric phenomena, but according to a lot of the witnesses, they're pretty sold that they have seen that. And so, yeah, there are a lot. In fact, I think in this case, I think the mayor even said that he saw this phenomena.
What's the most haunted part of the train? Do you know? Is there any pattern? Is it a passenger car? Is it the engine car? Is it the caboose?
Well, they're all pretty haunted. In my opinion, though, it's actually the caboose. And I do have a theory about that. And first of all, there's a few really, really intense ghost stories that occur in cabooses. And the one that I read, I found a historical account from probably the early 20th century, late 19th century. And this occurs in Kentucky. And the number of the caboose was 17736. And this became an infamous caboose because there was an apparition of a lady that was seen in the caboose, appeared like she was crying at times, and it probably wouldn't be that significant of a ghost story because, like I said, a lot of ghost stories about all these different sleeper cars, freight cars, engines, all of this. But the conductor who witnessed this phenomena was actually a skeptic to begin with. And when he saw it and he observed it for not just a flash of a second or two, but over what sounded like maybe a minute or so. And his impression was that it was an actual full-bodied apparition, and that what he tried to do was immediately try to debunk it. He tried to look at, was it lighting? Was there someone who snuck on board? And he could not find a real reason for this. And the story is pretty intense that I found. Now, the story why this caboose was haunted, it sounds like this woman, her husband died in an accident that involved this caboose. And then there's another story called the Old 1908, which is a caboose that was once part of the Louisville and Nashville train line. And in this case, it almost seemed like the caboose itself was possessed. They said even when it was still, it would shake or suddenly lurch. And at one point, in a train station on a flat station, a rail yard, it became, and again, remember, cabooses aren't self-propelled. Somehow this caboose went up the track a long distance, up an incline, and then threw itself off the tracks. And when the crew came to recover this caboose, they found that the brakes were still set. So there's that, where not only they really didn't see an apparition, but the entire caboose seemed to be a spirit in itself. In my opinion, if you're going to have one car that is most like a home, it would be the caboose. So this is the area where the conductors lived and worked and traveled. And to me, it seems more like almost like haunted house than anything that the train could put out there.
That's fascinating. We're going to take a time out now, but and sadly, cabooses are sort of a thing of a bygone era. They've replaced them because the brakeman used to be in the caboose, and now they've, I guess, basically replaced the whole caboose with a little black box. It's all computer. However, Matt, stay put. We'll come back and discuss more haunted rails, tales of ghost trains, phantom conductors, and other railroad spirits right here on The Conspiracy Show. Stay with me.
Take a look around. What do you really see? This is where you can tell all about it. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
Haunted Rails. Matt Swayne is here. How do we get a copy of the book, Matt?
Best bet is to go onto Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. Make sure if you go down to your independent bookseller, you let them know that it's out there and see if they'll bring it in for you.
Now, as you described earlier, some of these ghost stories are just that, likely. They're legends, they're ghost stories. But occasionally, there seems to be some significant physical evidence to back up these stories. And one such case takes place in Duffy's Cut, a section of railroad near Malvern, Pennsylvania. Tell me about this.
Yeah, that's probably the most fascinating for me story in the book, because it has, as you mentioned, I try to be very upfront and say a lot of this is ghost lore, folklore based on ghosts and spirits. But I think this story gives you a key to something a little bigger. And the story is that there were two brothers who every Thanksgiving would sit and listen to their grandfather tell them ghost stories. But probably the most famous ghost story he would tell them happened in this Duffy's Cut. And he told them that, and it was true, he was a secretary for the railroad. And part of his job was to collect these ghost stories from people who claimed that they would be walking by this Duffy's Cut and they would see these strange things. And one that they mentioned in the account is that one fellow was walking by that Duffy's Cut and he saw lights that seemed to be dancing, different colors, red and blue, in this area. And he told the boy's grandfather that this was the spirit of these Irish people and these Irish workers who were slain there. And the overall impression to at least the grandfather was this was ghost lore. This was merely folklore, and that there was no real truth to it. But the two brothers decided that they were actually going to try to find out the truth. So they, along with some actual anthropologists from a nearby university, did a dig in this area where these ghost sightings were. And sure enough, they found what seemed to be a mass grave of about 57 people. And there were stories that these were victims of cholera. And there are other stories because the team uncovered what seems to be evidence that some of these people were shot. So here you have ghost lore of an area that turns out to have some real, honest to goodness research evidence behind it, that something happened in that area that either was collected and put into the collective consciousness of these people in that area, or that there is something really there. And then later on, these anthropologists, I think they teamed up with some paranormal researchers who also investigated it more of as a paranormal thing to try to contact the spirits.
Did they actually uncover bones? Did they?
Yes.
Dig?
Yeah.
They did.
Sorry. It was a mass grave, and it appeared that some of the skeletons, some of the bones and skulls had what looked to be bullet marks and bullet holes.
And again, this mass grave was located right beneath where these orbs had been seen, correct?
Yeah. Yes. Exactly where it was.
So it'd be interesting to note and I'm assuming that once they located these bones, I don't know, did they leave them where they were, or did they give them a proper burial in a cemetery? Do you know?
I think, if I'm recalling the story correctly, I think they did give them a Catholic burial in that area.
And then did the sightings of these orbs continue, or did it stop?
I haven't heard any fresh stories that came out of there. That might be that they just haven't been documented. Right.
Or in other words, maybe the orbs or the ghosts were trying to draw attention, to a crime. We're here. We're buried under here. They wanted people to know.
Yeah, and that seems to be the results of that paranormal investigation seem to be more like that. They were talking about the boss who was in charge there, who worked them pretty hard, almost to death. So that kind of came up during that aspect of it. But it's an interesting blend of anthropology and paranormal investigation, which you don't encounter a lot when you're researching these books.
The great science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, he had an experience with a ghost train as well, didn't he?
Yes, he did. As a matter of fact, and this one was pretty cool for me too, because I've always been a Philip K. Dick fan. And if you read Philip K. Dick's opinion about paranormal phenomena, it kind of goes back and forth. A lot of times he seems like he embraces it, and other times he's seems to be a skeptic. But the story about haunted rails that occurred to him was that he and his wife at the time lived in a town, Port Reyes, in California. And according to his wife, who writes this, Anne, his wife at the time, who wrote this autobiography about Philip K. Dick, she said that he would complain constantly at night when he tried to sleep, and he was kind of a noted insomniac. He said he could hear this wail of a train going through this area, and of course, Anne basically kind of debunked it, said it was the wind, that there was no trains in the area.
Matt, pardon my interruption. I got to take a time out. We'll leave this as a cliffhanger, and we'll get to the rest of the Philip K. Dick ghost train story on the other side. Matt Swayne stays with us. Haunted Rails right here on The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Sarrett.
We are back with Matt Swayne, the author of Haunted Rails. That's the latest. Before the break, we were talking about science fiction author Philip K. Dick, who lived in Point Reyes Station, California, and was an insomniac and would complain about being kept awake at night by the sound of a distant train whistle or train horn. You continue with the story, Matt.
Sure. Anne said that there was no trains in the area, but in fact there were. It was crisscrossed with lines back in the day that had since been taken out. And there is actually a story of a ghost train in that area. And it deals with a engineer whose daughter either eloped or was abducted. And in a fit of vengeance, this engineer climbed into his train and took off screaming into the night trying to find her. And that years later, people claim to hear this whistle and the steam from this engine erupting. And so there is kind of a connection between this little bit of ghost lore and keeping poor Philip K. Dick up at night.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned one ghost train story from Canada, but is it primarily an American or a North American phenomenon, ghost trains and haunted rails, or is it worldwide?
It seems to be worldwide. It seems, at least as far as I could tell, the U.S., Canada, and in Europe. As a matter of fact, in the U.K., there are a lot of ghost stories that deal with the subway system, the tube there. I would say the tube is probably more haunted than most of the above ground trains. And I've found ghost trains in Sweden. There's the story there of this silver bullet that people claim to see that was a very distinctive car that was taken out of commission. It was very distinctive because it was silver, and most of the cars there were green, and people say that it appears at times. And also in the UK, you also find a lot of these stories about areas where the elemental spirits were disturbed by the creation, the construction of railroads, and that they seem to take their vengeance out by there's one story about a demon train that goes across, I think, Scotland, and they claim it's really run by these elemental spirits that are disappointed that they were not appeased when they put this railroad system through their area, their territory.
We're familiar with, of course, the Orient Express and the Agatha Christie novel based on that, Murder on the Orient Express. Do you have any ghost stories from the Orient Express?
I don't, but now that you mentioned it, that's an obvious one that I should have looked into, but I don't even recall really looking into that, but maybe for the sequel.
And I'm guessing there will be one because you started off thinking I may not have enough to pull a book together, and then you end up, of course, with too many.
Right.
Is there what would be the creepiest haunted train story that we haven't heard tonight so far?
Yeah, there's a bunch, but for me, there's a story of also another town in Pennsylvania called Austin, Pennsylvania. And this occurred, I think, early 20th century. The story is that there was a train yard in this near this town, and the workers would see this very strange figure, and the way they described it was pretty eerie. This tall, thin, abnormally tall, thin man dressed all in black. And of course, they would try to chase him out of the train yard. And when they gave chase to him, they talked about how he kind of slithered through these cars, and that how he could jump into the boxcar and out the other side. And by the time the workers would get there to chase him off further, he was absolutely gone. And these sightings occurred for weeks. And then there was a collapse of a dam just above town. The resulting flood killed, I think, a few dozen of the townsfolks. And then the sightings suddenly stopped. And for me, it reminded me, one, of the Mothman prophecy, which I read as a kid, that this strange Mothman would appear, and then there was this bridge collapse. And it also gave me kind of the way they described it felt to me like the Slender Man entity that was talked about, just a decade or so ago.
Right,
so it
or
was
Spring Hill
creepy.
Jack. Spring Hill Jack as well.
Yes, also, yeah. So I think that's one of the creepiest ones for me.
And are there other haunted objects? We mentioned cabooses, and we mentioned the engine and so forth. Other just objects related to the railway that can be haunted?
Yeah, there's a lot of stories about haunted tunnels. Seems to come up quite a bit. They can be tunnels where there were accidents. Sometimes there can be incidences. In one of the stories, there was allegedly a murder near the tunnel, and it's somehow these spirits are trapped in this tunnel. So there's tunnels. There's also bridges that are apparently haunted. One's called the Screaming Bridge. I think that's in Indiana, where a worker allegedly was buried alive inside one of the pillars, and that you can hear him scream and try to get out, usually around Halloween. It's either good ghost lore or really, a creepy ghost story. But so all of those objects, infrastructure, are just as haunted as sometimes as the station houses and the cars and railroad lore.
Do you ride the train at all, Matt?
I haven't been on a train in decades, but my wife and I really want to take the train to New York City here one day.
Any reports about passenger trains being haunted by the ghosts of other passengers?
I have heard, and there are a few stories in the book of that. Some of the sleeper cars, I think the Venasta is the one that I'm thinking about right now, where there are passengers who still haunt those railroad cars.
One of the scary things about the current pandemic is that we may be heading into a severe recession, if we're not already there, or maybe even a depression, perish the thought. And back, during the last depression, there were hundreds of thousands of people, well, maybe not hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of men who would, in order to look for work, would hop aboard trains, hitch a ride on a train. They were called hobos and so forth, and they would often encounter, I think they used to call them the yard boss, the men that were equipped with a club, and they were, the yard boss did not treat these hobos very kindly. Are there any stories that you've collected or heard about regarding hobos and ghosts? Yeah,
some of the ghosts in the book, there are a number of origins. So some people say they're conductors, some people say they're workers, some people say they're passengers, some people say they're hobos. But probably the one of the most famous is Maury Graham, who was, I think he was like the 5-time hobo champion of the world. He allegedly haunts a caboose that's in a museum. I think it's called the Mad River Museum. I'd have to check on that. But, he was a hobo that really felt like they were needed to be commemorated, and they were a special group, and that his apparition has been seen outside of that caboose. Now, I never got the sense of whether that caboose had special meaning for him or whether he visited that museum or anything like that. But that's one of the stories about the hobos.
Haunted rails, tales of ghost trains, phantom conductors, and other railroad spirits. Once again, Matt, how do we get a copy?
Oh, check it out on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. You can also go to my website, mattswayne.com. There's usually links there.
Always a pleasure, Matt. We'll talk again soon, I hope.
Hey, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And yeah, let's do it again.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you. All right, that's it for me. Back next week with a brand new show. In the meantime, don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be revealed, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light. What I say in a whisper, proclaim from the housetops. Move over, Aphrodite, I'm coming home. Or at least up the stairs. Good night.